Absolutely. Hey, good morning, everybody. Today's daf is Kuf Yud Gimel in Masechet Chullin. We are near the top of the page. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. So, yesterday we saw that Rav Murray asked about some meat that he was salting. He was salting two pieces of meat. He salted a piece of treifa meat, not kosher meat, and he salted a piece of kosher meat. And the problem was he did it together in the same container. And so as a result, the juices of the treifa meat touched the kosher meat. And so the question was, is that now nothing was hot, but it was all being salted. So the question was, is that going to be problematic? And Rava told Rav Murray that in fact it is problematic, that the juice from the treifa would end up being absorbed by the kosher meat because, after all, Shmuel tells us that salt makes things like they're boiling hot. And so as we pick up on the fourth line of Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, we say third word from the end of the line. The Gemara now offers three challenges to Rava's response to Rav Murray. So, question number one, Meisvei, I'll ask you a question. Dag tahor shemulacho im dag tame mutter. One sec, we have a brisa that says that when you have a kosher fish and you salt it with a non-kosher fish, everything is going to be permitted. So my lav shahayu shneim meluchim, isn't this talking about where both of them are salted? And so as a result, the end result, the final answer that Rava has provided must be wrong, because here we have a situation where two things, a kosher and non-kosher thing, are salted at the same time and everything is fine. And in the situation of Rav Murray, Rava told him that it's not fine. So how could that be? So, no, your presumption is incorrect. Kagon shaya tar maliach v'tamei tafel. No, the salting was of the tahor fish, and the tamei fish was just secondary. It was not actually being salted, and so as a result, or bland, it was not being salted, and so as a result, that's that's why it didn't have anything any issue. And in fact, there's a verse in Eov that says tafel mibli melach, meaning that it's bland without salt, and so as a result, that's a tafel is an indication of lack of salt. And so as a result, the answer to question number one is that that isn't the same situation. Here we're dealing with a situation where both the kosher and the non-kosher fish were being I'm sorry. Murray's question was about where both the kosher and non-kosher meat were being salted, and here it was just the kosher fish that was being salted. And so take a look at Rashi. Tafel mibli melach. It means one, two, three lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi. It means without salt. Dahashta lo pulit, because and so as a result, it's not exuding anything. It's not discharging anything. The tame, the non-kosher fish, midi at all. So aval shneim meluchim. If both of them were salted, the tame nami palit, so that as a result, the non-kosher fish would also discharge some of its liquid, some of its taste. Asur, then the kosher fish would be prohibited. Because again, tame maliach v'tar tafel. And certainly, if in fact the tame fish was being salted and the tahor fish was not, because in that situation, the tahor fish would not be discharging anything, so it certainly would be able to absorb. So that is question number one, and again, not a problem because we're dealing with only one item being salted in that brisa, and it's the kosher item. V'hamid say, but 1 second though, that you now gave me an interpretation of that brisa, but that interpretation seems faulty because hayatar maliach v'tamei tafel mutter, because we have a specific case where the tahor is salted and the tamei is not salted, and we say that it is mutter, which implies that if that's the discussion in the second case, miklal dereisha b'shishneim meluchin askinan, that implies that the first case is talking about where they were both salted. And so doesn't that show that it must be that the first case was where they both salted? And therefore, if they were both salted and you're telling me that it's mutter, therefore Rava's response to Rav Murray must be incorrect? No, not necessarily. Don't say that the second case is a different case, but rather parushe kamefarish. The second description in the Mishnah, in the Brisa, excuse me, is just explaining what the first part said. And so, how do I understand it? Tahar shemalacho im dag tame mutter. So the way to understand that Brisa is as follows: when you salt a kosher fish with a non-kosher fish. And ketzad, what is that case? Shahayatar maleach v'tamei tafel. It's a case where the kosher fish is salted and the non-kosher fish is not salted. And so as a result, that's where it's going to be permitted. So, and hakinami mistabra. You know what? It makes a lot of sense to say that this is the interpretation, that the second line of the brisa is giving us the explanation of the first line. Because if you were to tell me that the first part of that brisa is dealing with both of them are salted, well, hashda shnei meluchim shari. Once you tell me that if both of them are salted, tar malir v'tami tafel mi boy, do you need to tell me anything about the case where the kosher one is salted and the non-kosher one is not? That is a more logically kosher situation. Meaning, once you tell me that even though the non-kosher fish is discharging some of its liquid and it's going to touch the kosher fish, but because the kosher fish is also discharging, it's not going to absorb any, well, then certainly if the non-kosher fish isn't discharging anything and only the kosher fish is discharging, there won't be a problem. So if you tell me about the two salted pieces first, you don't need to tell me about where you salt only the kosher and not the non-kosher. So imishum ha lo area. The response is, you know what? Although everything you said is true, it's not actually a good proof. Because Tana Seifa Galuye Resha, maybe you could say that actually the second case is helping us know what the first case is talking about. Don't say now. Of course, again, this is a contrafactual. We're just showing that there is another way to read our brisa. That we originally brought this brisa as a question to Rava, and then we ended up saying, well, maybe it's even a support to Rava, and now we're saying, you know what? No, you don't have to read it as support to Rava. You can read it as contrary to Rava, but it doesn't have to be contrary to Rava. So now we're offering this possible read, and what is the possible read? The following: that one we say, don't tell me. Again, this is not, in fact, how Rava would read it, but this is an alternative read. That don't tell me that the beginning of that brisa is talking about where you salt just the kosher one and the non-kosher one is not salted. Aval shneim meluchim asur, but if you were to salt both of them, it would be prohibited, because the second case in that brisa, Tana Seifa tar melech v'tami tavel, the second case tells us that rule. So miklal dereisha shneim meluchim. So the implication is that the first case involves both of them being salted. And even so it's permitted. Meaning, yes, you're absolutely right that the second case isn't necessary once we understand what the first case in the brisa is telling us. But the second case is necessary because without it, we wouldn't know what the first case in the brisa is telling us. And so that could be the alternative read. Again, wouldn't be the Rava's read. And so as a result, we've now offered two alternative reads of this brisa, one completely consistent with Rava, one completely inconsistent with Rava. And so as a result, the brisa is neither a proof to Rava nor a question. And so now we have the third and final question on Rava's response to Rav Murray, and we say Tashma Miseifa de Seifa. Well, what about the very end of that brisa? Because what does the end of that brisa say? About im hayatami meliach v'tahor tafel asur. If in fact the non-kosher piece of fish was salted and the kosher one was not salted, well, then the kosher one is going to be prohibited. So, what is the implication of that? The implication is Tame Meliach Atar Tafel Huda Aser. Maybe it's only because the kosher one was unsalted. Hashne and Meluchin Shari. But if both of them were salted, then it would be permitted. Again, contrary to what Rava taught in connection with Rav Murray's situation, where when both of the pieces of meat were salted, the kosher meat was not kosher in the same container. The kosher meat was not kosher. So, no, not necessarily. It could be that we use a language of one being salted and the other being unsalted because that's the language that the Brisa is talking about. I did Tana Resha Tar Melech Tafel because in the earlier part of that brisa, we even explicitly say that we're dealing with the kosher one being salted and the non-kosher one being non-salted. So Tana Nami Seifa Tame Melech V'Tar Tafel. And so as a result, we'll use the opposite case in order to teach us the opposite rule. And it doesn't necessarily tell us what the truth would be about if both of the pieces were salted. It could be that if both of the pieces were salted, it would be non-kosher, just as Rava tells us in Rav Murray's situation. And so as a result, we brought three challenges, we responded to three challenges, and so Rava's response to Rav Murray seems to be where we end. If you salt something kosher with something not kosher at the same time, it is going to be problematic. Okay, so now the Gemara addresses the process of salting meat. And so we have the following statement. Siman Bisra Demanach Nafkuchza. So we're going to see that there are three statements by Shmuel, and these three lines, Bisra, Manach, and Nafkusa, are going to be a mnemonic for helping us remember them. So Amar Shmuel, Ein Habasar Yotze Midei Damo, Ella Imkain Mocho Yafa Yafa. You're not going to get the blood out of a piece of meat unless you salt it really well. Umadicho Yafa Yafa. And you have to then rinse it very well. And in fact, there's another statement, well, a later statement by Rav Huna, next generation. Itmar Rav Huna Amar Moleach U Mediach. You salt it and then you rinsed it. Oh, 1 second though. B'masnisa Tana Mediach Umoliach Umediach. You're supposed to rinse it, then salt it, and then rinse it again. So that seems inconsistent both with Shmuel and Rav Huna. The low pligi, you know what? They're not actually arguing. Ha dechalale be tabacha, ha delochale be tabacha. One is where it gets rinsed in at the butcher's, and one is where it does not. So the truth is, you do need to rinse, salt, rinse. That's the process. But the question is if it was rinsed already at the butcher, well, then you don't need to rinse it again. Rav Dimi minaharda malach le b'milcha galalnisa minapet uminapetz le. So Rav Dimi would use a milcha gilalanisa. So let's take a look at what that is. Rashi tells us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines down in the Rashi on narrow lines of Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. Milcha galalnisa, melech gasa. It's a thick salt, and in fact, when you compare kosher salt in the supermarket to other forms of salt, it is specifically a larger crystal that exists in connection with the kosher salt. Okay, and then he would be menapitzle. Menapitzle is the next words in the Gemara. So, and back into the Rashi. In fact, again, worthwhile keeping a finger on Rashi here. Menapitzle lemilcha. You would then shake off the salt. La'achar zman, after a period of time, dam nivlaba, because now the salt that is on the meat has absorbed the blood. Aval malach daka, but if you use thin salt, ein sarach lenapes, you're not going to need to shake it off. Shehi mitechet ba'atzma, because it's going to melt off by itself, and so as a result, that's the story. So Amar Rav Masharshia, Rav Masharshia says, ein machazikin dam bivnei me'ayim. You don't have to. Well, let's actually take a look at what Rashi to explain what these words mean. Ein machzikin dam, einam bechezkas dam. These things, you don't have to worry about blood in them. Liaser imlo nimlecho. To say that they're prohibited if you didn't salt them. Because, in fact, you have to salt every part of the animal. And so here, if you're salting every part of the animal, so what about these parts if you forget them? So what parts of them are they? Tirgama, it was explained that this refers to akarkasha, the rectum, umeaya, the some of the internal organs, namely specifically some the stomachs, vahadra dechanta, and what goes around the kanta. The kanta is it's not exactly clear whether it's the small intestine or some things that are around the small intestine, but basically the hadra dechanta seems to be the large intestine, and so that seems to be the rule. And so the implication of all of that. Take a look at Rashi Vakarkasha. It's 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, about 18, 19 lines down. Last word on the line. Vakarkasha to Bechaya. Again, that seems to be the rectum. Aval hale, but when it comes to the heart, Vaharia and the lungs, Vahakaved and the liver, Vikanta gufa and the this part of the internal organs that is called the kanta, around which the large intestines seem to go. So yesh behen dam, they do have blood. Utzrichen lemimlach, and therefore you have to salt them. So although we said that you don't have to worry about the innards, where it's not all of the innards that don't have to be worried about. You have to worry that there are certain parts that are naturally without blood in them, flowing through them, or not much blood flowing through them. And so as a result, if you don't salt those pieces, that is going to be okay. But in general, the meat of the animal needs to be salted. So that was statement number one. So Amar Shmuel says, a second statement, when you salt a piece of meat, you have to put it in a vessel that has holes in it. And so as a result, that's an important process, part of the koshering process. You can't leave it in a vessel that doesn't, because if you do, well, then the piece of meat will reabsorb the blood that it has emitted. Rav Sheshes malach le garma garma. Rav Sheshes took that to an extreme, and he would salt each piece on its own, even in a perforated vessel. So Trey, my time alone. Why wouldn't he salt two pieces together? Mishum de parish uvalim high, because he's worried about one piece exuding blood, discharging blood, and he's while the other piece absorbs it. So chad nami parish mahai gisa ubala mahai gisa. Well, if that's true, then you need to have the same concern even about a single piece, because maybe the blood is coming out of one end, but it's going back into the other end. But we don't say that. Eloshna. We don't say that. We say rather that as long as the piece is discharging blood, it's not going to absorb blood, and therefore the same thing is true if you salt multiple pieces together. And so as a result, the halacha is that you can salt multiple pieces together. So take a look at Rashi. Eloshna. It's right opposite the line above the Torah or Hashalem. And for those who have a different version of the Gemara, it's 9, 12, 15, 18, about 22 lines down. Elalo Shna Umutter. And so as a result, you are allowed to salt two pieces together. The time of Kiddim of Hershin on Le'el. And the reason is we gave it yesterday on Daf Kuf Yud Bet Amud Bet. The Kolzman should Terudin Liflot, as long as the piece is busy discharging, Einon Bolin, it's not going to absorb. And once it stops discharging, Kvar Nachzeh, well, then the other one is not discharging either. And so as a result, you're going to end up with two pieces that aren't discharging, and because there's a hole in the vessel where all the blood drains, none of the blood is going to be left in there, and so as a result, they're not going to absorb any blood, and so everything is wonderful. So that is the second statement of Shmuel. Third and final statement of Shmuel, Amar Shmuel, Mishum Rabbi Chia, Hashobah from Mifrakta Shel Behema kodum shetetze nafsha, if you break the neck of an animal before it has completed the dying process, after you slaughter it. So harei zeh machbid es habasar v'gozel es habriot. You've made heavy the meat and you have stolen from others. Umevli adam be'evarim, and you've caused the blood to be absorbed in the limbs. So Rashi explains, uh, uh, it is Hareza Mechabit Es Habasar. It's the next Rashi after the last one that we just did. So Lefisha B'Shas Shchita Sahi Truda Lahotzi Dam. That at the time of the slaughter, the animal is busy using its muscular structure to throw out blood as it is trying to, of course, get the blood that in the neck that is caught to the place where the blood is supposed to be flowing. So it is essentially doing the process of getting blood out of the body. The kishashover bifrakta, when you now break its spine, mitok tsarasa, because of the additional pain that you're causing, ein ba koach, it no longer has the strength. Lahit anach ulahotzi dam, to cause the blood to get expelled. Vihi nacha, and now it rests. Vishokatat hadam vishokatat, and it's normal. It's quiet. It's no longer doing anything. Vadam nivla bavireha, and so the blood gets absorbed in its limbs. Umach bidabasar, and causes the meat to weigh more. The nimtza goes on. So now you're going to be found to be a robber, essentially, as habrios keshehu mokra, because now if you sell it, it's going to be mashkel by weight. V'hadam shokel, the blood, the extra blood that's in it is going to weigh it down, and so you're selling it at an unfair price because that blood, well, we're going to see. The question is whether the blood can come out or not. So now ibailahu. So back into the Gemara. The Gemara asks the following question, and we are beginning of the third wide line in the Gemara. Ibailahu. Heiki Kamar, what's our situation? Is it machbid es habasar v'gozel es habrios mishum demavlia dam be'evarim? Is the issue that you're making the meat heavy and robbing the people because the blood is being absorbed in the limbs? But halodidei shapir dami. But if you don't sell it, but rather keep it to yourself, everything is fine. And Rashi explains, holiday day, when you keep it for yourself, you can't say that he's stealing. Shari, so it would be permitted. Because now you're eventually going to get the blood out and everything will be fine. Odilma, or maybe what is meant when it says, umavli adam be'evarim, and the causes the blood to be absorbed by the limbs, that is separate from the blood not leaving, but rather it's telling us, maybe even if for himself it would be prohibited. And Rashi explains, next Rashi, with last Rashi before the Mishnah, and there are actually two prohibitions here. Chada de gozel es habrios. One is stealing. V'chada de mavliya dam. And the second is that the blood gets absorbed into the limbs themselves. V'shuv eno yotze v'ochel dam. And so as a result, you can't get it out with salting, and therefore you're going to end up eating blood. And that would be not kosher. So teku, the Gemara says that we are leaving that unresolved, and so as a result, you have to be careful. If you slaughter an animal, you can't then break its neck. You have to allow it to expel all of the blood as it can through its final movements of the animal. And so as a result, that is the way we end up saying. And so that brings us to the next Mishnah, and the next Mishnah discusses the prohibition regarding meat and chicken, or fowl more generally. Hamala as ha'of, if you have chicken or meat, or a chicken of some kind of bird, im hagvina, and you put it with cheese ala shulchan on the table, eno over below tasa, you're not violating a negative command. Now, Rashi points out, Eina over below tasa, he gufa lo itzrich. Dahala labdo raisa. Of course, you're not violating any biblical prohibition because having regular meat with cheese on the table was only a rabbinic prohibition in the first place. Ella diyuka dila itzrich. We're going to see that the Gemara is going to try to derive something from this. Okay, so we can pause there in the Rashi because now we're going to see what the Gemara is going to derive. So back into the Gemara, beginning of the Gemara, ha'ochlo over below tasa. What's the implication? The implication is that if you eat it together, after cooking it together, presumably, then you would violate a biblical prohibition. So shma mina basar of b'chalav d'oraisa. That teaches us that the prohibition of chicken or any kind of fowl with milk is actually biblical. Nope, not necessarily. Ema hamala as ha'ov imagvina ala shulchan eino bali de lo tase. No, maybe you should read that Mishnah, the Mishnah that we just read, not as saying that when you put meat, the chicken and cheese on the table at the same time, you didn't violate a biblical prohibition in that action of their being on the table, but you would if you ate it. No, what it's saying is that if you put chicken and cheese on the table at the same time, you don't have to worry about coming to any kind of negative biblical transgression because the prohibition of chicken and cheese is only rabbinic. So two different ways that we could read that Mishnah, not any definitive outcome. So the next Mishnah details lessons that we learn from the repetition of the command not to cook a kid in its mother's milk. It's repeated 3 times, Shmot Kaf Gimel, Shmot Lamed Daled, and Dvarim Yud Daled. So let's take a look. And we're going to see that you're not allowed to benefit or cook meat and milk together. And we're going to see what kinds of meat and milk are included. So we begin with that discussion. Basar behema Torah, b'chelev behema Torah. If you're dealing with kosher meat of a large animal, of a kosher animal, meaning a domesticated animal, and you are dealing with milk of such an animal, asur levashel, you're prohibited to cook it, basur bahana, and you're prohibited to benefit, and of course, you're prohibited to eat it. But what about the other situation? Basar behema Torah, if you have kosher meat, b'chele behema tamea, but milk from a non-kosher animal, or basar behema tamea, or you have non-kosher meat, b'chale behema Torah, and you have kosher milk, mutter levashel, you're allowed to cook it together. Umutter bahana, and you're allowed to benefit from it. Obviously, you're not allowed to eat it because either the milk is not kosher or the meat is not kosher, but just the cooking and the benefiting are okay. Rabbi Akiva says, Chayav ha'of eina min Torah, that when we say behema, it means only a domesticated animal. It does not include wild animals, and it does not include birds. So they are all not prohibited biblically. Shenemar lo tefashel gedi b'chalev imo shalosh pamim, says it 3 times that you should not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So what does that come to limit? Meaning, why does it say a kid in its mother's milk? Prat lechaya. So that comes to a kid excludes an undomesticated animal, a wild animal, ula oaf, and a kid excludes a bird, ubehema tmeya, and a kid excludes non-kosher animals. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, no, that is not the lesson that we learn, but rather Nemar. It says in one pasuk, in one of the references in Dvarim, Perek Yudalat pasuk Kaf Aleph, it says, first, it says, lo sochlu chol nevela. It says that you shouldn't eat any nevela. That's the beginning of the pasuk. Lager asher bisharecha titnena va'achla o machor lenachri ki am kadosh atala Hashem elokecha. And then the pasuk concludes v'ne'amar at the end of that pasuk lo sefashel gedi b'chalev imo. Don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. Etsha asur mishum nevela. anything that would be subject to a nevela prohibition, asur levashel b'chalav. That's what you cannot cook with milk. Oaf she'asur mishum nevela. A chicken which is prohibited as a result of it being a nevela, meaning if you don't slaughter it and it just dies on its own, you're not allowed to eat it. Yachol yehei asur levashel b'chalav. I might have thought that it should also be prohibited to have with milk. So Talmud Lomar, no, b'chalev imo. It has to have its mother's milk. Yatsa oaf she'ein lo chalev aim. A chicken doesn't have mother's milk, and therefore it's not going to be prohibited to be with milk. And so we end up with three viewpoints. And so Rabbi Akiva says that chicken and wild animals are not going to be subject to the biblical prohibition. They're only rabbinically prohibited. And Rabbi Yossi HaGlili says, no, undomesticated wild animals that are kosher are absolutely covered because they do have mother's milk and they do have the prohibition of nevela. But the only thing that's excluded, and now it may even be totally excluded and even be kosher, is chicken with milk. And so we will see more of that in the future. So, Minohani Mili, how do we know this? Now, what is it exactly that this is referring to? This is referring to the fact that the prohibition is on all meat in the Tanakhama's position. So Amar Rabbi Lazar explains, Amar Kra v'yishlach Yehuda as Gedi Haizim. And Judah sent the kid of goats. This is in connection with the story of Yehuda and Tamar. And so he sends a kid, and it tells us Gedi Izim, that the Gedi there in that case is a kid of a goat. So what is the implication? Now we turn to the next page, Kof Yud Gimel Amabet, Kan Gedi Izim. So that implies a kid of goats. Ha Kol Makom Shenamar Gedi Stam Afilu Para B'Rachel B'Mashma. So it implies when the Torah only refers to a Gedi, so such as when it says Lo Tevashel Gedi B'Chalevimo, and it doesn't say Gedi Ha'izim, that implies that the Gedi there is even if it's an infant of a cow or even of a ewe, of a sheep. And so as a result, that is the implication, b'mashma. So, v'leilef minei. So one second though, maybe we should learn from that situation. And just as Gedi ha'izim, just as Gedi is Gedi ha'izim in connection with Yehuda and Tamar, so too, whenever we have a Gedi, it should be Gedi ha'izim. No, there's a second verse, Ksiv Kra Achrina. There's another pasuk. This is a pasuk in Bereshis Kaf Zayin, pasuk Tet Zayin, where it says, referring in the situation where Rivka is putting a skin of the hair of a goat on Yaakov's arms in order to Yaakov to get away with it. It says Ve'es oros gedaye ha'izim, that with the skins of the kids of goats, that's how she covered his arms. So the implication there is that in fact this is going to be that also kan gedaye ha'izim. When we say gedi, we mean a kid of goats. Ha kol makom shenemar gedi stam, implying that everywhere else, when it only says gedi and it doesn't reference ha'izim, afilu para b'rachel b'mashma, the implication is even cattle and sheep. So v'leilef minei. So one second, why not learn from that situation? So habulahu. So you meaning again say that just as in that situation, gedi ha'izim, when we say gedi, we mean gedi ha'izim because the Torah specifically says ha'izim. So maybe we'll say that everywhere in the Torah when it says gedi, it means gedi ha'izim. So habulahu shnei ksuvim aban ka'echad. We have two verses telling us the same concept. V'kol shnei ksuvim aban ka'echad ein melamdin. And when you have two verses telling us the same concept, they do not teach beyond themselves. Well, that works according to the opinion that says you don't learn from two verses. But there is a verse that says that you can learn from two verses, you just can't learn from three verses. So what do you say? So no, tre miute ksive izim haizim. They're actually further limitations because instead of writing goats, it says the goats. And so the goats is a further limitation. And so it's highlighting that only in these situations does kid mean only goats, a kid of a goat. And in all other situations, kid means all kinds of infant behemoth, infant animals, including the children of cattle and sheep. So Amar Shmuel says, now we're going to, again, see what we learn from the lessons of the pasuk, of the fact that we have the repetition of lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo 3 times. So let's take a look. So gedi, the language of a kid, implies l'rabos es hachelev. It includes the chalev part of the kid itself, which is prohibited, and it too, if you were to cook it with milk, would be a violation of cooking meat with milk. Gedi l'rabos es hamesa. Gedi also tells us that it includes a cooking of a nevela of a kid with a if it dies without shchita, it too, if you cook it with milk, is going to be prohibited. It'll violate the prohibition of cooking meat with milk. Gedi l'rabos, so the third addition, hashalil, it comes to include cooking the fetus of an animal with milk. That also is included. And gedi lahotzi es adam. Gedi excludes blood. And gedi lahotzi es hashilya. The word kid, it excludes the concept of the placenta, meaning the placenta with milk would not, or blood with milk, does not violate the prohibition of cooking meat with milk. Gedi lahotzi es tameya, and gedi also excludes non-kosher animals. Okay, so we've now had 6 lessons, from Gedi, and now we turn to B'chalev Imo. B'chalev Imo, what does it come to teach us? Lo B'chalev Zachar. It means mother's milk. It's got to be milk of a female animal. If a male animal happens to lactate, which does occasionally happen, that's not considered milk. B'chalev Imo, v'lo B'chalev Shchuta. It's milk that the mother, as an alive animal, would potentially nurse its offspring, but it does not include the milk of a slaughtered animal. After you slaughter the animal, there's milk inside. Now, we say rabbinically you cannot eat it, but that milk is not going to violate a biblical prohibition of cooking meat with milk if you were to cook meat with it. B'chalev imo, and third lesson from the mother's milk, below b'chalev tamea. It doesn't include the milk of a non-kosher animal. Now, hatlasa gediksive. The Gemara points out that we referenced 6 lessons from Gedi, but Gedi is only written 3 times of lo tevashel Gedi b'chalev imo. V'anan shita darshinan, but we created 6 lessons, 3 inclusions, 3 exclusions. So Kasavar Shmuel, Isser Chala Isser. No, I'm going to explain it to you. The reason that we have 6 lessons is because actually we're going to cut it down to just 3 lessons. And really, Shmuel believes that when you have one prohibition applied to another prohibition, it does take effect. The Isser Chelev Umesa, Mechad Kra Nafki. And we use one of the references to Gedi to tell us both the concept that chelev, that if you were to use the fats that are not kosher and you cook that with milk, or a mesa, if it's a nevela, if it died on its own and you cook that with milk, those 2 things would you would learn that those are also prohibited with meat with milk if you were to do it, and so that is all learned from one verse. So so as a result, we have now that we've cut it down by 1, we have 5 lessons, but 3 references. So we need to do some more cutting. Dam nami lav gedihu. Also, when it comes to the lesson about the blood, it's not actually a lesson that we need a new word for, because blood is not a kid. Blood is not the animal. Vishilya nami, and similarly the placenta. Pirsha ba'almahu. That's just separated stuff. It is not actually the animal itself. And so you don't need a separate pasuk to teach us that. So now, as a result, that takes away two more of the lessons. And so now, Pashal Lahutre, we're left with two more references to Gedi. Chad Larabos Shalil, one comes to include the fetus, Chad Lamaute Behemoth Meya, and one comes to exclude a non-kosher animal. And so as a result, although Shmuel taught us six separate teachings, it's really three teachings that would need a new verse in order to give us the teaching. And so we have three verses and we have three lessons. B'savar Shmuel Isser Chalal Isser. 1 second though, all of this presumed that Shmuel actually believes that a prohibition takes effect on another prohibition. But Shmuel said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, how do I know that if a Kohen who is Tameh eats Truma that is Tameh, he is not going to be subject to death at the hands of heaven? Now, what is the case that would subject the person to be death at the hands of heaven? It would be a case where a Tameh Kohen ate Tahor Truma. But once the Truma becomes Tameh, then the prohibition does not exist. And what's the reason that it doesn't exist? Shne'emar umesu bo ki yichaluhu. And he's going to be killed as a result of the fact that he has profaned the truma. But parat lazo shemuchulelet ba'omedet, that comes to exclude this case of the truma that's tameh because it's already defiled. And so as a result, Rashi points out, take a look, Rashi, 1, 2, 5 lines down in the wide lines of Rashi, prat lazu, alma lo asi usur tuma hakuf, v'shehu b'misa bidei shamayim, v'chayel al iser tumas truma she'asura ve'omedes alav be'iser she'aseh. We see from here that the prohibition of eating of the fact that this person who is a Tameh person eating truma does not fall on the piece of truma that itself has become tameh, which is also prohibited as a result of the opposite of the violation of a positive commandment that you have to eat it while you are tahor. And so as a result, that shows that at least with respect to this statement, Shmuel does not think that something that when you have one Isser, that you can have another Isser apply to it. Because if he did say that you could have another Isser apply to it, well, then the Isser of being a Tameh Kohen should also apply, and eating Truma should also apply even if the Truma is Tameh. So, Ibayis Ema, actually, we can give you a number of different ways to resolve this apparent contradiction, where, according to us, we initially said that Shmuel says that a prohibition that takes effect does take effect on an existing prohibition. And this statement of Shmuel in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, where it seems that he does not say that a prohibition takes effect on another prohibition. V'shayni hasam, we could say that really ba'alma iser chal, I'm sorry, excuse me, iba yasema be'iser chal al iser. One answer would be we could say that that a violation does apply to another violation in general, but the shiny hasam, the case over there of the Kohen eating truma is different. Demiyat rachmana umesu vo, because the Torah specifically says, and that's the implication of the shenamar that we had in that verse that was cited by cited in Rabbi Eliezer's name, that it says umesu vo ki yichalu, he's going to die because of it. It is going to be the cause, namely that it's got to be tahor. That is, the vo there is an exclusion, and so it's excluding tameh truma. So that would be answer number one. But in general, he would apply the concept of iser chal al iser, ibayasema, or you could say ba'alma kasavar Shmuel ein iser chal iser. Really, like the statement he made in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, we do not apply one prohibition to another prohibition. So what about our case in connection with the Gedi, where we included the prohibition? We said both with respect to the a chalev and with respect to the animal that dies on its own, that we were going to apply those prohibitions to the concept of cooking meat with milk. B'shayni hacha de Rabbi Rachmana gedi. No, the fact that we have the language of gedi, that's why we didn't have to write gedi. We could have just said that if you did b'chalev imo, that having any kind of basar in chalev imo would be a problem. The fact that it specifies a kid, that is going to indicate that it's actually going to include even chalev and nevela. So that's answer number two. So the answer, again, that he would generally say that Isser is not chal on Isser, but the special situation, we have additional inclusions, one for chalev, one for nevela, and so as a result, we do have enough ways to learn the lesson. The ibayis ema hadidei hadirabe. And the final way we can answer this is to say it's not a contradiction. One is Shmuel's statement on his own, and this other statement where it implies that he does not hold of Isser Chalal Isser, he made that statement in the name of his teacher Rabbi Eliezer, and he was telling us what Rabbi Eliezer thinks. Rabbi Eliezer thinks that the prohibition does not take effect on another prohibition, but he himself would think that it does. Okay, so last little bit. So boy mine Rav Achadvoy bar Ami Merav. So Rav Achadvoy bar Ami asked Rav the following question: Hamavashel b'chalev gedi shelo heinikamahu. What's the law if you were to use milk of a kid that did not nurse? And Rashi explains. Shelo heinika, 5 lines up in Rashi near the beginning of the line. Lo yalda miolam, it never had any children. V'yeshla chalav, but it already has begun lactating. Kishahaya karova limei lidata, because it's pregnant and is about to give birth. So midai kinan imo shahaisa imo kvar. Do we need, when we say in the Torah that lo b'tvashel gedi b'chalev imo, it means that the imo must have actually been a mother already, or lo, or do we say no? It just means that it has to be mother's type of milk. So Rav answers Amar Le. Rav explains from the fact that Shmuel needed to tell us b'chalev imo below b'chalev zachar, the fact that it tells us a mother's milk and not the milk of a male animal, zachar hu delo asi l'klal aim. It's a male because the male will never become a mother. Aval hai, but when it comes to this kid that is about to give birth, kevan deba l'klal aim, since it will become a mother, asur, it is also prohibited, and therefore all milk is prohibited to cook with meat, even if it was milk from an animal that has not actually given birth. All right, so Shmuel just taught that chalev and milk would violate the prohibition of meat and milk, but we will see that that is not the only view of that topic. So, but for that discussion and debate, please stay tuned for tomorrow's daf. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom. Looking forward to continuing our learning together.